Chapter 10, Lesson 4, Use square roots to solve quadratic equations. So we're getting into a little bit more complexity here. So let's look at a couple of equations here. So if we were asked to figure out the roots of this particular equation, so the first thing that should scream out to you is that you need to get all the constants on one side. So that's what's happening here. Moving over the minus 7 to the other side by adding 7 to both sides. So you end up with x squared is equal to 16. And here's the key part. When you take the square root of x squared, you're going to end up with two possible answers on the other side. You're going to end up either with positive or the negative square root of 16. Because think about it, if you multiply a negative times a negative for the square root of 16, you're going to end up with 16. If you multiply a positive times a positive for square root of 16, you're going to end up with 16. So whenever you do square roots, it's sort of like absolute value. You're going to end up with two values almost all the time. So the final answer is going to be this, because the square root of 16 is 4, and then you have the plus and minus piece. Let's do a couple here. So for these ones here, really this is just getting everything on one side that you can, and then just having the term that is squared on the other side. So in this case here, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to divide both sides by 11. So you end up with y squared is equal to 1. And then you take the square root of both sides, and when you do that, you end up with y is equal to, remember this piece here, plus or minus 1. Because minus 1 times minus 1 is equal to 1, and 1 times 1 is equal to 1. And you can always plug these values back into the equation to see that they work. For this one here, what we have to do is, since it says z squared plus 13 is equal to 5, we have to bounce the 13 over. And when we do that, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up with z squared is equal to negative 8. Okay, now something really important here also is this idea that whenever you take a square root, unless you're dealing with something called imaginary numbers, which we're not even going to get into, you can't take the square root of a negative number, because a negative number, you just can't. You can never multiply two numbers together and end up with a negative number. So in this case here, when you take the square root of z squared, you're going to end up with z, and then you're going to end up with plus or minus the square root of negative 8, and that just won't work, so there's no solution. No solution there. So a little bit more complexity here. What we have here is a different problem here. 9m squared is equal to 169. Now 9 doesn't divide nice and evenly into 169, but you might recognize that both of them are perfect square numbers. 169 is 13 times 13, and 9 is 3 times 3. So it's the same concept. We're going to move the 9 over to the other side. That's what happened here. Divide both sides by 9. And then you take the square root of the whole thing. Remember that plus minus piece. It still is there. When you take the square root of that number, when you take the square root of 169 and the square root of 9, what you're really doing is you're doing the square root of 169 and the square root of 9. So that's going to be equal to 13 over 3. And we can't forget that plus minus piece of that. So that's what's is going to be our final solution there. That's how we get that. Let's try a couple here. This one here, you're going to divide both sides by 36. You end up with x squared is equal to 121 over 36. You probably recognize those are both perfect squares. So x is going to be equal to the plus or minus the square root of 121 over 36. So x is going to be equal to plus or minus 11 over 6. For this one here, we have to bounce that 81 over, and you end up with 16x squared is equal to, subtract 81 from both sides, which is just equal to 0. So now you probably can figure out it's just actually x is going to be equal to 0, because when we divide both sides by 16, then we end up with x squared is equal to 0. And the only thing, when you take the square root of 0, you're going to end up with 0. For this one here, we need to bounce the 225 over to the other side, so we end up with 4x squared is equal to 225. Now we're going to divide both sides by 4. X squared is equal to 225 divided by 4. Now take the square root of both. You end up with x is equal to this plus or minus the square root of 225 over 4. And that's going to be equal to plus or minus 15 over 2. Because 15 times 15 is 225. Again, as we just add a little bit more to each time, each time we go ahead and do a little bit more here. So in these ones here, you're going to have to actually use the square root button on your calculator probably to figure it out. So what we have here is we have this problem here. This should have a 2 there. 2x squared plus 5 is equal to 15. So when we bounce the 5 over to the other side, we always deal with the constants first. Then you're going to end up with 2x squared is equal to 10. We're going to divide both sides by 2. So you end up with x squared is equal to 5. Then you take the square root of that, and it doesn't come out nice and neat where you come up with a fraction or just a whole number. You end up with the square root plus or minus the square root of 5. That's why we have to leave it like that. Then you plug that into your calculator, and you're going to come up with a value that's this when you round it to the nearest hundredth. So let's look at these. So what we have here is we have, again, the same sort of thing. We're going to bounce the 8 over. So this is 7x squared. Move the 8 over is equal to 21. So this is x squared. It's going to be equal to 3. Then we take the square root of that, so it's going to be x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 3. When we plug that into our calculator, we're going to get 1.73 if we just round to the hundredth spot. So that's plus or minus 1.73. And that's going to be our actual answer. It's not a perfect answer, but it's an approximation. So for this one here, same sort of thing. And I'm just going to do these ones quickly and then explain them. So just so I could write these out quickly. Here, what's happening is you go ahead, you move the 15 over. Then you divide both sides by -6. Then you end up with 5, and then you take the square root of 5. Don't forget the plus minus piece. And then you end up with plus or minus 2.24. For this one here, it's a little bit uglier. You got to go ahead and subtract 7 from both sides, so you end up with 5. Change that into a decimal. Then just plug it into the calculator. Take the square root of it, and you're going to end up with this value there. So, last ones, again, the most complicated ones, of course. So what we have here is we have 3 times x plus 3 squared, that whole expression squared, is equal to 39. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to get rid of the 3 first. So divide both sides by 3, because we can't do anything on the inside of that expression without, unless we get rid of the 3 first. So when we do that, we end up with x plus 3, that whole expression squared, is equal to 13. Then x plus 3, when we take the square root of it, you're going to end up with x plus 3, because when we take the square root of that expression, we're just going to go ahead and change it to x plus 3. And then that's is equal to plus or minus the square root of 13. Then we bounce the 3 over to the other side. We end up with -3 plus or minus the square root of 13. And then we just plug it in and see what that value is. That's what that is. So here, for this one here, we're going to divide by 5 to start with. So it's going to be x minus 1 squared is equal to 8. Then you take the square root, so it's going to be x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 8. So now it's going to be x is equal to 1 plus or minus square root of 8. And that value is going to be, so that's 1 is equal, or x is equal to 1 plus or minus 2.83 is what the value of that expression is there. And when we do that, we're going to end up with, let's see, we're going to end up with x is equal to 3.83. That's one possibility. Or x is going to be equal to negative 1.83. I believe that's correct. And that's how it works. I'm going to do this one as well. So I did this problem out, and I just want to walk you through it a little bit here. So rewrote it up here, and then divide by 2. When you divide by 2, you're going to end up with y plus 4. That whole expression squared is equal to 9. Now you're going to take the square root of both sides, so you end up with, remember that plus and minus piece. Plus or minus the square root of 9, and that's a nice neat number. So when you take the square root of 9, you end up with 3. So that's why it's plus or minus 3. Don't forget that part. And then you just bounce the 4 over, so it changes to negative 4. And then it's negative 4 plus or minus 3, and the two values you're going to end up with are negative 7 or negative 1. And that's it.